Hello, and welcome to episode 81 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. Today, we're going to take a look at some notes, kind of coalescing into an outline for the third product. So we've moved on from our first two. I don't know how much I have to recap this, but the first product being a quantitative text analysis of MTurk hits, human intelligence tasks, job posts. Second piece, moving into an experiment that used a survey method where we posted surveys regarding readability that asked folks to translate media into readable summaries. So I guess actually asking them to do a task rather than surveying them about readability as such. And then we took from that the results of that experiment, how readability functions on MTurk, a concept that popped out of the first piece as we talked with our guest last time, Seth Berlow, about the concepts that popped out of that first piece, readability and trauma. And then we discussed why readability was the one we had sort of honed in on. I guess that would be homed in on, sorry. And rather than trauma, although they both seem to be kind of characteristically, perhaps not inherently, but characteristically human things. So now we're at the point with this third piece, we're going to be operating methodologically through theory. And so we've been kind of going back and forth about what that's going to entail, in part because this third piece has had to absorb the remainder of everything we were doing with the other pieces. But now we're at a point where we really kind of have to determine, to make choices about what's going to be inside the circle and what's going to be outside, as you always do.
Yeah, this was the miscellaneous bin, and now it can't be that anymore.
Yeah. So we'll take a look at, we've been sort of going back and forth about, so what's going to happen here, what its orientation is, right? At least one thing that's been consistent is the concept and in fact term artificial, right? So the idea of artifice has remained in our discussion about what this third piece will be about, how it'll work. So that seems to be, it feels like that's kind of the center that we're orbiting around, is this notion of artifice for a few reasons. One, it's very much crucial to this discussion of artificial intelligence and new models that are moving toward general artificial intelligence. The definition of that is a little sketchy itself, but the idea, it's what we think of when we think of AI, something that is a black mirror, right? It's a human that you see in the screen, but more so. Not coincidentally, sort of like God, right? The big guy in a white robe who's like us, but more so. That's what we really want to see with AI. It's like I can talk to it. It's like us, but it knows everything, and it does. Its ethics align with mine, so it doesn't immediately kill all of us. It can bring benefits to humanity, whatever. So artifice tends to be kind of a I don't know, a MacGuffin. I don't know what it is. It's just it's important to this discussion. In some ways, it's the enemy of the humanist, in that it's, the human is the human and the other is artificial. We can maybe see a Platonic lineage in that. But then also we see it relevant in technocratic conversations where artifice is, it's differently bad in some ways, where it's like, something isn't a true artificial intelligence unless it's autonomous, right? Unless it doesn't need us. If it needs us to keep it on the rails, to keep us coherent, then our job isn't done yet, right? And we certainly see it at play in discussion in the terms and associated concepts of artificial intelligence, and then the kind of cutesy thing that fueled our work, artificial intelligence,
Yeah.
which is understood to be faked artificial intelligence. This comes up a lot in these sort of grandiose deployments of artificial intelligence. I've got a couple in our notes that are new, where it's like, you can type an app you want into our new service and our AI will make that app for you. And then it turns out, no, it's actually poorly paid people in India who are doing this
Right.
shell game of, this is a computer doing it. It's like, no, right? Now, this is the pejorative definition of the original Mechanical Turk. It's this chess playing robot. It's like, no, it's a person
Right.
in a desk underneath it. It is also the term that Jeff Bezos trotted out when discussing Amazon's Mechanical Turk, right? This is consciously artificial intelligence. It's, this pool of cheap labor that does things that are at any given moment either difficult or, and this may be almost the same thing, cost prohibitive for
Right.
a computer to do.
Yeah.
But now we also have artificial intelligence, right? And that's something you were looking at. What's a thumbnail definition of what that is, according to those papers?
Artificial.
The three artificial intelligence, right? Which is the name of that paper, right?
Oh, crap. Yeah.
Let me pull that up.
Yeah.
Here
Big old binder out.
we go. Let me share my screen. Right. So now we have
Right.
because this is in our discussion of things like recursion.
Yes, that's right.
So artificial intelligence, crowd workers widely use LLMs for text production tests. So this is where now at this level, imagine taking Mechanical Turkers, and they're given these jobs that are tricky for machines to do. But in order to do them, they just deploy LLMs, right? Trying to keep this sort of straight in our head. But then what's happening is this kind of recursion, or, eating your own dog food, where they're using the things that are and giving information to things that are then feeding that forward.
Right. Yeah, so it ends up not being not just not useful, but it ends up, right, there's I think the worry around stuff like this is that sort of notion of the sort of model collapse. But as we've talked about before, it tends to be the, as we work through these various conversations, I think we're pretty confident about our sort of humanist foil around the notion of artificial, right?
Yeah.
That clearly, for a certain perspective, that notion of artifice is being deployed as a critique that's holding up some sort of non-artificial, I don't know, organic, natural, a priori intelligence that's there. And then how do we know that such a understanding of artifice exists, right? If we're kind of making an argument that both sides, right, or the various factors have actually a similar relationship to the notion of artifice, how do we demonstrate that? And I think precisely this is articles about worries about recursion, this weird recursive artificial intelligence seems to surface or manifest the idea that they too, proponents of AI, imagine that what something is truly intelligent is something that can be disconnected from an artifice.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, they've got the same they're more, whereas opponents are bothered or they're troubled by the notion of artifice. I think it strikes us that proponents of AI or people working on AI are sort of embarrassed by artifice.
Mhm.
And the discourse around recursion tends to be where you can suss that out, that ideally they would make a truly intelligent thing, and then that could be just let loose, right? You wouldn't, it would no longer need any kind of artifice or scaffolding, or right, the idea that it has to keep coming back to human intelligence, human data, is somehow a problem, because ideally an intelligent entity would be, I don't know, autonomous, self-sustaining, which in that sense they're resonating a lot with opponents of artificial intelligence, who also imagine that intelligence works as some sort of, right, a platonic ideal that's already there, or a platonic ideal that can be reached. So in that sense, they're two sides of the same coin. One is sort of essentialist version, an essentialist critique of artifice, and then the other one is perhaps a teleological critique of artifice. That one is, we can escape it to get real intelligence, we can make it, or it's already there and this is somehow a artificial version of it, right? Which would be the more recognizably, I think, Platonic argument, right? This is somehow doing something bad to an already there natural intelligence, whereas the flip side is a sort of, I mean, or I think another, thinking about the theoretical, is that you've got a kind of humanism that's bothered by artifice as a, I don't know, perversion's that's probably too freighted a word. And then you've got a kind of transhumanism on the other side that imagines some sort of escape from eminence or materiality that would necessitate you keep coming back, right? There's no escape. You always are going to require something to make this work. Which aligns, I mean, at least for me, with the kind of, I think, post-humanist take that we're bringing to bear on this. And in fact, right, someone like Rosie Berdodi, who writes about post-humanism, sees transhumanism as a kind of another humanism.
Yeah, right.
And so in that sense, there are other people who've made resonant theoretical arguments that these seeming opponents are actually, they've got some core thing about which they share. And for us, that's visible in the way that they respond to the term artifice.
Right. And, but, I don't think we're straw manning in that, unless I'm misstating here, like when Annette V was a guest, she at least was, one of my takeaways is she, pretty ardently espoused the humanist perspective, was pretty much like, no, I'm, cautious of impingement on the human. And that might be grounded in certain, because she, made some appeals to things like sensory experience and, things that are different about a human's experience. Because I think we also touched upon things like, disability studies, and how it has to walk an interesting line of, and this also happens with feminist critique. It's particularly as it confronts things like trans women, right? It's like making arguments about the essentiality of bodies is useful, but very dangerous. It's fraught. Right? It's like, well, there's just something about inhabiting a human body that makes human special. It's like, that's a tweak away from sort of heteronormative positions about, whose body are we talking about here, right? What counts as a human body? What counts as a woman's body, right? Do you get to have a woman's experience if you only if you have a particular organ, right? It's like those arguments about an essential humanity, like any essential argument, it's like they're powerful and useful and terrifying at the same time, right?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this. I'm thinking of, I don't know if I have this book. This is where I look back at my shelf and see if I have anything for show and tell. When do I cut bait, or when do I just keep showing you the back of my head? Right, there's well, in part there is
What book is it?
I don't know. Well, this is a separate book now. I'm just going to jump to this because I have this. I think we've talked about this is the dawn of everything. And they kind of they're also making an argument against the kind of essentialist or teleological, right? That human beings moved from small bands of hunter-gatherers naturally to this, naturally to that. And like there's actually archaeological evidence that human beings were constantly experimenting with how to live together, right? You can have agriculture without cities without bureaucracy, right? All these anyway.
It's Whig history. It's like we're here, therefore everything led to this. You know?
Right. But a lot of what they trace, and this also comes out of engagements with posthumanism in like Black studies or race studies, is you look at the historical moment when all of a sudden people needed a definition of the human. It's historically strongly correlates with the slave trade, with colonization, right? All of a sudden, Europeans discover others, and they now need a definition of what counts as a human, right? There are various moments in time where no one's fretting over what makes somebody a human. That even fretting over what makes a human isn't a universal human phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's you got, Europeans who basically around Europeans all the time go to what's now North America and realize there's groups of humans living radically different from the way that they live. That's a mind fuck. And then they need to come up with a reactionary rearguard definition of the human to help explain that difference, and then also to help justify, right? So even that notion of what really makes one a human, that question, forget what answer you come up with, that question itself emerges in a particular historical moment.
Right.
It's not just the danger of essentialism. It's why does one need essentialism? It's already right. So in that sense, is the definition of man racist? One of the arguments is that the act of defining it is already racial. Even if you don't come up with a racist definition, the desire to do that is historically linked to right. That's a racializing question.
Yeah, and certainly things like legitimating the slave trade, right? I mean, as I always do, I'm always poking at things like the legalities, and we talked with Seth about this a bit, right? Yeah. Because things like the Zong massacre, right? It's like it was this case where it was an insurance case, and a ship of slaves sank, I think, kind of like right outside of Bay, and it was allowed to sink. And so it became an insurance case about were the slaves inside property or people. And, it was one of those situations where it's like humanity and what a person is gets defined in a fucking insurance case, right? This wasn't some grandiose Renaissance notion of what is a man, right? Which is a gendered question already. But it was, are you going to pay this insurance or not? Because a ship full of slaves sank and we filed a claim, Yeah.
Which, I mean, I think if you do any kind of, this just basic Foucault history, that's where these things always get worked out. These are not just philosophical questions. These are whatever a human is the practical outcome of particular. I mean, right. This is our taskscape argument.
Yeah. The philosophical question is a practical question, right?
Right.
There is no navel gazing, and even that practice is prompted by practicalities, right? And things like the exigence of being allowed to do it, right?
Yeah. No, there's a great, interesting. There's a great book called The Burglar's Guide to the City.
Oh yes, I teach that sometimes.
Yeah, it's one of those that's just like for our shtick, it's just like that's the new ghost map for a couple years. But the idea of the philosophical question of inside and outside is largely determined by lawyers who want to prosecute you for burglary as opposed to, I forget what,
breaking
Yeah,
in.
because what makes it burglary is you did it inside something. So then a prosecutor has to make the case that you were inside, which means that, as you're pointing out, the lawyer is doing philosophy.
Yeah, right.
But they're doing it through, well, can we imagine a wall here? Or a wall makes an inside, but I now have a gun, a microphone that lets me hear through the wall. So for this device, the wall isn't there anymore. So am I inside your house? But that argument is, whether you're inside or not, you can't. Also, what's interesting about that is you can't resolve that argument without recourse to the practical material exigence of, because the whole notion of inside outside is itself all right. This is the cultural technique stuff we were batting around with, that the conceptual split between inside and outside is impossible without some medium that generates it.
Yeah.
And it does, it not only generates the inside and the outside, it generates the concept of inside and outside.
And so perhaps, more precisely, these aren't necessarily philosophical questions, they're rhetorical questions. Which is, because I never finished this thought, but, the other reason why we were looking at artifice is because rhetoric doesn't shy away from the artificial. And, what we have to contribute is this discourse of these are always discursive constructions, right? It's like, we're language based, and we accept that the idea of a scaffoldless, right, an autonomous essentialist resolution is probably impossible and almost certainly useless, right? I mean, as a rhetorician, you probably can't say impossible because that would be an absolute, but it sure seems like it. Viz, have we ever made a essentially, hold on one second.
Call from
Walgreens.
To accept, press 1. To send a voicemail, press 2.
Voicemail it
At
is.
any time, you may press star to join the call.
Hi.
I was really hoping it was about to say what your prescription was, and I was going to Google it.
That's a heart pill.
Oh,
Trying to grow one.
you got worms, buddy.
Take an ivermectin. But anyway, so yeah, that essentialist just like we can never dust our hands and say, well, this is the inside and this is the outside. Similarly, with this discourse, it's like, what does saying this is an AI get us? It's like, there is no resolution to that question of, is this AI or not? There isn't one.
Yeah.
We've never resolved anything. I mean, honestly, not to pick on philosophy, but it's like, what have you found in your entire millennia of existence? Give me one. One thing that you found.
I'm starting to read this, his master's voice. There's like a 15-page just critique of philosophy that I'm half on board because he's a math guy doing it, but it's very similar, and it has to do with the relationship to empiricism, which I think he takes more narrowly in a positivist sense. But I think rhetoric adds anyway. The long story short, I think you're onto something, and that made me think of something else. But I'll stop now.
Yeah, so it's and so potentially what our piece would do is try and not resolve the question of artifice, because it's irresolvable and probably useless. Even if we did, and it's not clear how you would determine if you ever did, it's Gorgias. It's not clear how you'd ever determine if it's like, well, we finally found it. It's like, was that hinge on ubiquitous consent? Like, would everyone have to agree we found? It's like, how would you even determine that?
Right.
Anyway, even if you did, which we can't, but even if you did, it's like, what would that get us? Nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, all it does at best is push back the question of, okay, we finally resolved what artificial is. We know what an AI is. From here on out, we're still gonna have the same questions. I'll be like, well, is this one? And then, and like, and well, even if it is, it's like, okay, but we still have these questions about what should it do, and how should it, and are we comfortable with what it's doing to us and labor, and it's like it doesn't really, at best, it just kind of pushes the question back a notch.
Right.
But I don't want to say it's like useless, because as we've touched upon, it's like calling the war on drugs a war matters, because once you've resolved it's a war, and I mean, this is Plato's big trick. Well, it's Socrates, it's Plato's Socrates' big trick.
Yeah.
Once you get those ground rules where you say, okay, well, it's the war on drugs, it's like, it's over, because you've called it a war. So everything flows from that, right?
Yeah.
What you call January 6th matters. And the left has kind of ceded that, it's like, once you call it, which it now, I would say is, because people have been convicted of sedition who were
Right.
involved in it. It's like, well, that is definitionally an insurrection. That was an uprising to overthrow a government. People were convicted of sedition.
Yeah.
It has to be an act of sedition then, right? And that matters if you call it an insurrection, a riot, a protest, right? It matters. At the same time, as you can see, it doesn't fix anything. Even if to history, that is the insurrection of January 6th, it doesn't really get us out of, okay, well, then does this person go to jail? Does Trump get elected? It doesn't really fix anything, you know? Anywho, so let's take a look at this, this outline.
By the way, you were at the Capitol on January 6th, correct?
Taking photos, yeah. The different Capitol, too. It was in Frankfurt. Okay, let's share this.
Trying to get, because you're a big Angela Merkel stan.
Okie doke. You can see this, yeah.
Yes, sir.
So this does still include the chess cheating scandal. That feels like one that at some point might go away, but here's why it's in here, because like the contention, I'm going to walk through this in part just so to see if it makes sense to me who wrote it, as much as explaining it to you. So what this scandal shows, in the chess cheating scandal, is fairly recently there were a couple of incidents really where high-level chess players were accused by other high-level chess players of cheating, specifically in one notable case by having anal beads or some butt plug device implanted that would signal through vibration how to play, right? So the idea here was getting outside automated help. And interestingly, in these cases, it frequently, even though that doesn't require an automated confidant, it is assumed in these cases, right? Where it's like a chess program is telling you the right moves, perhaps because of the rapidity of it, or as we'll see, because now chess is often framed as a solved game. But anywho, so the scandal was, these accusations of you've clearly got a butt plug in you, or something, a ring. There was a notable one that had to do with poker, which is meaningful. But anywho, so we've moved from what we saw in the Turk of this notion of the artifice being, that's not a robot playing chess. We can't do that. Yeah. This is the 1700s.
Don't you know this isn't 2024?
So there's got to be a dude in there. But now it's flipped, where it's like there's no way this guy could be playing like that. There's got to be a robot somewhere stuffed inside him, right?
This reversal is so compelling. It's hard to not want to.
Well, and I think, as we'll see here, there's a potential bridge into the conversation, which, right? So this is because chess is solved, right? I mean, it's being depicted now, decried as a solved game, which, that's in a sense, yes, because it's like that set it's a closed set. So even though the number of chess moves may outnumber, the amount of atoms in the universe, it's like it's still finite, right?
Right.
Because there's only so many things you can do. So in a sense, it's like, well, yeah, it's finite. So even if we haven't completely, teased it out. It's like it's finite. And
Right.
so there is this kind of complaint that it's moved away from like who's the better strategist, and it's moved into the realm of poker. In fact, I have some sources that literally say chess has become poker. It's become about like feint, bluff, knowing your opponent and playing your opponent. And there was always some of that in chess, but
Yeah.
it's been seen, and the Turk shows this, right? Is that it inhabits this rarefied air of it's this kind of master rationalist, human intellect game.
Yeah.
And there's something about playing, about bluff that is dirtier, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like,
It's artificial. It's not actually what your hand really is.
yes, it's not playing the game. It's as you say, artifice, it's BS, right?
Yeah.
So there's this lament that chess has become like poker. It's been forced into the human against human, right? The world of the bluff, deception, artifice. It's the world of the tell, right? Because we've talked about how tells are different in poker and chess. And it's no coincidence that there are similar scandals in both, because there was a scandal targeting a woman in this case who the claim was she was wearing a ring. And, there's obvious sexist undertones to that. It's like, there's no way a woman is a top level poker player, even though it has happened. Well, in this case, it was like this woman who was seen as, a lightweight in certain.
Yeah, an amateur.
Right. And so chess is, because both people can see the board in chess, right? The tell in chess is kind of different. It's like, well, what are they? We have the same information, like,
Right.
So what can be tipped there? Is it like what you're trying to do, your strategy? Whereas in poker, because your cards are concealed, the tell is often like revealing information. I know what they've got, right? Because strategically in poker, it's like, if I know what you've got, I know what you're going to do and whatever. So the bridge here is, the schism here is revealing, because intelligence, right? You wouldn't have a Turk nowadays because they exist, right? Chess playing programs exist. And you could make the claim that they're better than us. And I don't mean you and me, I mean humanity, right? So that's not, sorry, go ahead.
No, and then what's interesting is whether or not that guy had the, chess playing anal beads. A lot of chess players, like poker players, practice by playing, right? In that sense, there's a sense in which that accusation is true, insofar as chess players and poker players now train using these automated programs. In that sense, in the way in which, as we know how education works, right, you internalize this stuff. You don't actually have to use a device to get it inside of you. The experience of playing it over and over again does a better job of right. It's in that sense, right? It's interesting if you would describe, it's interesting when you talk about, like, in something like baseball, right? Don't take steroids because it's not natural, it's cheating. Whereas the weight room isn't.
Yeah.
And right, there are other ways of parsing it, but there's a sense in which you are preparing yourself for, there's a weird sense in which when we'll cry foul for artifice and when we won't.
Yeah.
The idea that steroids is artifice, but bringing in a personal trainer and precisely tuned mechanisms to work out a particular part of your body. Anyway, it struck me as that and again, this is not to say that these are all equivalent, but there's a sense in which if you practice playing chess with artificial intelligence, that artificial intelligence it's in you.
Yeah. Bart Simpson describes this as, he calls it another kind of cheating. There's an episode where he's driven into, I believe, the classroom or the closet in his classroom because Principal Skinner and his teacher Edna Krabappel are having a tryst. And Bart's in the room alone. I forgot what mischief he was up to, but they come into the room, and so he scrambles into the closet. And during their their embrace, he has to get his mind off what's going on because he's in the closet, and there's a poster, I believe, of the solar system in there. So he just forces himself to memorize it, right, to take his mind off this. And then subsequently he gets an A, right? I mean, we find out about this because he's getting, I think, like a reward dinner for getting an A. And Lisa's like, all right, spill it. You know, how did you cheat on this? And he explains this. He says, you know, so I was, I memorized this chart. And then when it was on the test, I knew it, you know, and he calls it another form of cheating. And, you know, Lisa's like, Bart, you learned, but he sees this as another form of cheating because he's memorized the chart and put it inside his brain. It's interesting for us because it's like, you know, the Platonic screed against writing, this counters that, where it's like, okay, you don't like writing. What if I memorize the pages? And Socrates seemingly be like, oh, well, that's fine, because then it's in the brain, right? I mean, it's like, so the difference for you, Socrates, is just, can I ram that chart inside my head or not? That seems to be the difference, right?
Right.
Is it in the skin bag, Clark's notion of it, or is it not, right? Anywho.
That's recursion. That's what the recursion folks are worried about. It's not in there yet.
We'll explain that.
Well, the idea is, right, recursion would be recursion. The problem of recursion, you can, I know, like analogous, like is that take the Bart Simpson story, and the recursion folks would also find that to be cheating. Because the idea is that when they fully have an artificial intelligence, it wouldn't need recourse to new information. I don't know. It popped into my head, but I don't know, trying to maybe too quickly connect all these threads.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to.
Like in the sense that, like Socrates, the AI people want it all. It's not artificial so long as it's uploaded. It's there inside of it.
You know, I mean, what we'd have to do is see like what technocratic positions are on things like, because assumedly, I would think the goal, at least in the near term, isn't the model has encapsulated total world knowledge, you know? I mean, like, it has to have some notion of self-learning, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, it has to have some ability to, and in fact, I mean, it's like, in a sense, that's what the problem of recursion is. It's that it starts slurping in output from other LLMs, right? The idea of model collapse is I'm no longer mainlining true knowledge, i.e. human created stuff. I'm slurping up all these hallucinations, well, all this material, including hallucinations from the output of LLM. So I've connected the mouth to the anus, right? That seems to be the idea there, like in those papers.
Yeah.
That the fear is it's outputting, you know, the yokos, the hallucinated hybrid of a spiral and a yo-yo or whatever it was, and it's seeing that as true. So, you know, there is some interesting notion, and, you know, we've talked about, so then, like, is the job of the human simply to create stuff to feed the machine, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, like in this, it's like the schism here, and I mean, this is relevant because the question isn't chess. I mean, if it was that, we're done. We've got chess machines, right? The question is language, right? It's this world now, the world of the tell, of the bluff. It's language, and in fact, you know, if we look at things like the Turing test. And there's different notions of this, but it's relevant because it's deception. Can you tell the difference between the responses of a machine and a person, you know, without knowing which is which, right? That's the, you know, the litmus test. And it's linguistic, right? That's what AGI is based on. Not can it do chess? It's, do I think I'm talking to a human? Is it giving an output that is intelligible and indistinguishable from a human that would know this?
Yeah.
So, you know, as it says here, it's not the Turk, but it's the contemporary of the Turk, which are the talking heads, right?
Yeah.
Did Dr. Kang talk about who, or no, or was it Seth? Or no, it was Annette V. It was Annette
Yeah.
V, right? Who, I don't think she's published this, right? But she's looking at the brazen heads.
She needs to. Yeah.
So, right, I mean, this is another pseudo automaton that was displayed. I mean, Western history has these, and maybe other global histories, I don't know, but this sort of lineage of automatons that could talk, right? And now, sort of as a contemporary of Mechanical Turk, these were fraudulent, as in a sense the Turk was as well. I mean, fraud is a complicated thing, but it's being passed off as a statue, and then people were invited to go whisper a secret or a question, usually to the statue, and then put their ear to its mouth or whatever, and it would whisper an answer back.
Mm-hmm.
So think an 8-ball, but a very good one.
Yeah.
And it talked more than gave you text. So there are some examples here, right? The head of Orpheus on Lesbos, the island of Lesbos. A lot of times these were just like, interestingly enough, it was just like someone with a tube who'd be close enough to the unseen, or the statue would have a different tube that could collect and focus sound. As is always the case with this, it's like mechanically kind of neat, just like magic tricks today, where it's like, the difference is it's an inventive machine and a whole lot of practice,
Well, what's really interesting about there's a sense in which, as we've talked about, right, the Mechanical Turk, it's not a machine playing chess.
Yeah.
This also, the going back to that, it reminds me of, and we'd mentioned this, the disability stuff, right? Some of the really great, he's written lots of stuff since then, but Jay Dolmage's article on Hephaestus, which talks about Hephaestus making cyborgs and those kinds of things, but
and potentially being in a wheelchair himself. So that Hephaestus was lame.
Yeah. So anyway, it's an interesting connection all the way back to that, and celebrated for his artifice. Right.
Yes. Well, and so there's this history of this, right, including the brazen head of Albertus Magus, which was destroyed by Thomas Aquinas. But perhaps for our purposes, what's that?
I imagine, just to derail us quickly, I bet when you in particular, when you saw the phrase "the brazen head of Albertus Magus," like, boy, that had to just lit your whole brain on fire.
Yeah, a lot of these, because it's tied to like alchemy, but anyway, for our purposes,
this seems like a Colonel Brandon's product.
Yeah, there is a lot of that.
Yeah, it's okay.
Particularly like when Campellin was showing the Turk. It was just this time period of this kind of interesting hucksterism.
Yeah.
It's total Colonel Brandon's electrified salve or something like that. But anyway, Campellin himself kind of seemingly had a complicated relationship with the Turk, his own Frankensteinian monster, where he seems to, at least partially, he was an inventor.
Yeah.
That was his, that's how he lived, even though, he was genteel, but everyone's got to eat. And he seems to have at least partially made the Turk to get money to fund what he saw as more serious research, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense in which he seemed to be not exactly ashamed, but like conscious of the fact that this is bullshit, but seemed to have done it, in part, it's like, he made a promise about, I could make this thing in a year and, and earned money from showing it. But he experimented for years with talking machines, and in fact, outlined one and published on it. Right, there's this book he has from 1791, right, in German. Is there an English translation of this? I searched for it. I can't remember if I found one or not.
You have it in a comment, right? Is that
somewhere?
The mechanism of human speech with the description of a speaking machine.
Yeah, I can't remember if I found the text itself, and I believe there is an English translation of it itself. I believe there is. I should know, but I don't right now.
Let's just borrow that title for this third piece.
I know, I love it. But in part, that research was in his own time a little bit dismissed because these speaking machines were understood to be frauds, right?
Yeah. Isn't that why he eventually sold it, I think, or he really tried to get rid of it?
He did eventually sell it. Yeah. And I mean, the reasons might be complicated. I mean, it may have been, he didn't want to be associated with it. It may have just been financial, where it's like, I'm not dragging this thing around, the continent for another 10 years,
My basement's already full of sheep's bladders and rabbit heads. I don't have room for this Turk.
But it was seemingly that work was kind of just like the same way if like someone spent decades developing a PKE, a ghost sensing device.
Yeah.
You'd be like, yeah, but you realize that's bullshit. He's like, no, I've actually got a ghost, and maybe you do. However, it was in one of these little quirks, it's like his work there was interesting enough to so tickle a young Alexander Graham Bell that later Alexander Graham Bell was interested enough to obtain a revised reproduction, I think from Wheatstone, of that device. And Babbage also is roped into this, another kind of analogous case where it's like the automated loom came from not seeing computers, but from hearing stories about, at that time, fictitious stories, science fiction about what computers, what machine devices were automating.
Yeah.
And people saying, well, holy cow, if they can do that, then they can do these simpler jobs. And so they did it. It's like they made actual automated devices like the loom based on fiction about stuff that machines were already doing elsewhere. It's like, well, heck, if it can play chess, then doing this is easy. It's like, oh, but it can't. But it's too late. I already made it.
Yeah.
I already made the device.
Which is a really interesting, right? I mean, another kind of not, I don't know, for lack of a better word, sort of salvaging of the artificial, right? It's not whether its truth value is one of the things it provides, but it's the tip calculator in Seinfeld. It does other things, right? The artificial Turk does other things than being a fake chess playing automaton.
Yeah. So anywho, I mean, like partially what's going on here is there's a connection at the get-go, or from our sense. I mean, it's not the historical get-go, but for our sense, being focused on the Turk, this connection between, artificial and natural, human and machine, intelligent and mechanistic. I mean, in Compellin himself, the guy who made the Turk also spent his life making talking machines, right? Because he had this notion of intelligence, right? And Mazel or Mazel, that's who he sold the Turk to, I believe, directly. Okay. I can't remember if it was directly or if he got it later, but the Turk passed through a couple of hands before it burned up in a warehouse fire. Seemingly, that might be apocryphal, I guess.
I like it though.
But he also tweaked the Turk to say, I think in French, check, when it put somebody in check. It's interesting.
Right. I remember that.
And I believe, although I'd have to dig into this more, that in that case, it wasn't the human player saying check. Yeah. It was the machine would say, check, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. See, it was doing stuff.
Yeah, and so there's this interesting, Ricky Jay, the RIP, the recently deceased magician and historian. He was also an actor and author, kind of interesting dude. He has this book that talks about both of the Turk and the talking heads. And he has this statement here: what the inventors Campbell, Farber, and even Bell transgressed was not merely a boundary between science and amusement, but the far more profound one distinguishing the human from the mechanical, right? This is a magician, who are invested in that. Anyway, so it's this shift from intelligence being proven on the chessboard to being proven in the mouth, in a way, right? Fine, you can play chess, but can you talk to me? Right. And that's why Chat GPT is a crisis device for academics, for most occupations, right?
Well, it traces to that the sort of trajectory that Professor Kang was getting at, right? That each new thing requires a re-articulation of the human in well, okay, so you can do this, but can you do this, right? So at some points in time, it's but are you a vegetable? No. Oh, okay, I win.
Yeah, can you grow and reproduce, right? The vegetative. Anywho, so this is why, as it says here, Turing tests Searle's Chinese room, Turing's paper chess machine, which was like an early working out of how to do chess in an automated way, although it still relied on people, but it was more like sort of like a flow chart, I guess. Anyway, and I have this note here that these notions are Platonic, right? And in the Phaedrus, he rails against the written word because it's dumb.
Right.
It can't answer you. It just says the same thing over and over. That seems to be his problem. I mean, his main sort of thing is like, well, what the human is discussion.
Right.
So paper is dumb. It's like a statue that just stands there, right? When I mean say dumb, I mean it can't talk to you.
Yeah.
Of course, now it can. Now we're, of course, interrogating, yes, but is it a stochastic parrot? It's not actually conversing with you. It's just chopping up words, to which we would say, yeah, but that's possibly what humans, it's certainly a valid way to view humans.
Right.
So embedded in all this is the pejorative artificial, right? So we can see that in the history of talking machines, the assumption and accuracy that it's fraud, the permutations of artificial intelligence, artificial, and artificial intelligence. So these are fears about mingling, about recursion and collapse, right? Collapsing the natural from the artificial, the human from the machine. That's the fear here, is this Platonic displacement, right? They're impinging upon us. That's the humanist. I think that's the humanist fear.
Yeah.
So the humanists see the artificial as inherently not human and thus subordinate, right? It's not us, we're special. The technocrats see the artificial as imperfect and less platonically self-contained. To be truly artificial, it can't require the other human attendance to keep it running, right? Or it's flawed. It can't require us to push it back on track. It's got to be able to do this itself. Now, I think that can include a notion of self-learning, but it can't require altar boys to be around it at all times, like, gotta be a better term for that, but whatever.
I'll stick with altar boy.
Someone whose job it is to, maybe just priest. To keep the greater thing, like, from descending into monstrosity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this implicit notion of the Black Mirror. We don't actually, right? Artificial intelligence is already a misnomer, as is everything, but it's like, we've got that. We've had that forever. Maybe forever, but we certainly have had it. Wikipedia is much smarter than humanity. It is, if that's what you see intelligence as, right? It already has access to greater knowledge than humanity ever had. So like, we've already got it, right? But like, what we want isn't artificial intelligence. What we want is artificial humanity in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and these notes aren't the paper, they're the kind of the intro. So this is where rhetoric comes in, because we don't fear the artificial, right? Everything partakes in artifice. So-called human intelligence is lousy with it. I mean, that's the easy refutation of Socrates' complaint about writing, is it's like, well, the language in your head isn't yours, Socrates. You didn't invent Greek whole cloth. It's fake and it's in there, right? So, I mean, the artificial is already in it, that's also Clarke's main, if not one of, if not his whole main thing, it's one of his main things, is like potentially the human is always entangled with the other. It's Heideggerian as well, right? I mean, it's like a human invokes a world. So artifice is always there. Artifice or constructs, generated situations. That's, it's what we look at. And of course, we're focused on language. It's not surprising that the marker of intelligence has shifted from the chessboard to the conversation. We're here for it. So that's kind of like, why rhetoric, right?
Yeah.
Because artifice is our bag and language is our bag. And what we're talking about right now is artificial language.
Yeah. Which is not just our bag, but it's also our, I mean, right, if we really want to be clever, it's our baggage. I mean, that's the whole critique of rhetoric, is that it's artificial language. It's right. I mean, as I wrote I mean, as far as Plato's concerned, you could describe rhetoric as basically artificial philosophy.
Right.
Right. It's not just that we're comfortable with it. It's that you describe something as artificial language for lots of people, for better and for worse and or better. Right. That's what rhetoric does. It's a artificial engagement with language. Yeah.
Right. Because he has, in fact, that kind of table where it's, the true maintenance of the body is gymnastic. The false is cosmetic, right? The true maintenance of the soul is, in a sense, philosophy. The false maintenance is rhetoric, right? I mean, he sets up basically a table of the true and false arts of the body and the soul.
Yeah.
And that's where the kind of pejorative comes from. So this is what rhetoric brings to this dialogue: saturation in discursive artifice. That's our thing. We don't resolve essence, at least not in any absolute sense. We're not here to determine if something is artificial or if it's intelligent. So it's not like we're going to answer that question. We want to know how it is these things and what that implies, right? So we're not going to resolve, is this artificial intelligence? We're going to ask a different question, right? In what ways is this artifice? What ways is it intelligent? And what do those things rest upon and lead to, right? Determine ontological matters likely isn't possible and really wouldn't be of much use. We'll never just dust our hands and say, well, that's sorted out. What good would it do? To be sure, once you label something, and we've already talked about this today. Implications follow. Resolving that we have a war on drugs mean you can act as though you were at war. But what happens when you push the dispute? What then happens is you push the dispute down a level. We agree it's a war on drugs, but what then are we allowed to do in a war?
Yeah.
You don't really resolve the dispute by resolving the dispute. Categorization won't help us address ramifications related to labor, law, ethics, whatever.
Yeah. I like that. I like the you don't resolve the dispute by resolving a dispute. I like it precisely because someone would go, that's such a sophist statement. I'm like, yeah,
buddy. What we can do to contribute then is analyze instantiations of discursive artifice. What's being constructed? Upon what ethics does it rest? What are its probable effects? How could it be differently, or how can it be differently articulated? We're doing in this paper is precisely that: analyzing artifice and intelligent systems. Examining systems for artifice and intelligence, Turk, other examples in our notes. So that kind of brings us back to, we were collecting, particularly when we were talking more about cultural techniques.
Yeah.
We're looking at all these different things other than Turk, where AI as such was relevant, right? So we still have in our notes like this big old list of like, oh, and here's one and whatever. So we talked about a potential trajectory for the paper being that, where it's like, okay, well then let's analyze some of these contemporary deployments and see what's going on there. I mean, that may even give us the wiggle room to return to something like cultural techniques as a means to do this labor, right?
Yeah,
It wouldn't necessarily have to be the focus of the piece. It's like, here's a tool,
yeah. I think that would be,
you know, that we
And
can
then-
use to get sense out of what we're seeing.
Yeah, and then I think that move then allows us to, it gives us wiggle room in several directions. Because it goes back to that, early on, we looked at that book on heteromation.
Yeah, it's in the second piece.
Yeah, Wikipedia modification, game mods, all those kinds of things where it's,
I mean, if that's what we want to do is, look at some case study, basically, a couple of cases where it's like, here's what's happening in MTurk, here's what's happening in Wikipedia or Be My Eyes or whatever. And instead of asking, maybe we should look at like if we're bleeding toward, it's like the culminating thing is, so let's look at these things that are moving toward AGI. And that has been recently OpenAI, the partial creators of ChatGPT, have changed their kind of mission statement to more explicitly, they're saying like, we're aiming toward AGI. Previously, they've been saying what we're doing here is not that and shouldn't be mistaken for that because it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Now it seems they're like, no, that's our target, is something that could be called AGI. I mean, there's the option to, it's like, that's what we're leading toward, is looking at that.
Yeah. Well, I think partially, I think the more we've, dug into this, I think also it's not, it's clear that ChatGPT is a mechanical Turk in the sense that it's not, it too is, as in different ways at different scales to a different degree, has revealed itself as akin to human intelligence tasks, right? The ways in which there are human and machine collaborations. So in that sense, even though we'd be moving potentially out of MTurk proper, that what we've done, at least the first, is we've identified the sort of mechanism of the Turker, and now branching out. So there's also a sense, I think, in it's not just what we have to offer. Maybe this is not an additional complementary framework for the piece, right? It's not just what as people in rhetoric do we have to offer, but what as people in rhetoric who just did these other two things have to offer. So there's a sense in which it's also the payoff of the first two. The third piece now doesn't need to specifically address Amazon's MTurk,
right?
Because doing that has now prepared us, in concert with our rhetorical sophistic instincts, to then, okay, now what is your work on Mechanical Turks done other than help us identify some features of Mechanical Turk?
Yeah.
Which I think, to fulfill the original premise or promise of this, which is we're interested in what kind of theory about human intelligence is MTurk doing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the third piece, we're then going to sort of employ that theory that we saw emerging in those first two pieces to look at not MTurk, but to see the theoretical work that we limbed in Amazon's Mechanical Turk help us look at something else that's resident.
Yeah,
not limited in that way.
Yeah.
We're not really, in that sense, we were never interested in Amazon's Mechanical Turk.
We were.
We were.
Still
we
are.
But but in the sense that, like, we're not going to do what Ben Hanrahan did and do an ethnography of, right, that to a certain extent we were interested in what looking at Mechanical Turk would let us do.
Yeah.
Beyond being able to say something demonstrative about Amazon's Mechanical Turk.
Right, exactly.
MTurk was just an apparatus that we could use to develop a theory to talk about human intelligence.
Or at least in the first couple, we were more aligned with, here's something about MTurk.
Yeah.
But now we've moved to, given what we've learned about MTurk, we can put into practice and look at other stuff.
Yeah.
Anywho, so those, that is in our folder. It's actually in project outlines, which is a subfolder.
Ooh, so
It was already there.
Mhm.
I just tucked it inside because I was like, oh, well, this seems to fit. It is literally a project outline. So those are there, and it's like, we obviously don't have to follow that.
No, but I
Instruction.
really like the language you got there at the end. About, I can't think of the phrasing now. Pull that up real quick if you can.
You want me to share this?
Yeah, please. Yeah, this language of analyze instantiations of discursive artifice, I think is that clicked for me. In terms of just thinking about what this, other versions of this kind of thing
Yeah.
around. And it could be too, if we're thinking of, if there are resonant practices that we want to look at, maybe we because not, an ATM is not necessarily discursive, or Fiverr isn't, but I wonder if we could at least look at analyzing artifice or analyze instantiations of discursive artifice. And I wonder if we stick to even readability.
Constrain it.
Yeah. So we don't necessarily have to look at ATMs, but we could look at, Be My Eyes, or I don't know.
Well, and even those, they are discursive. The ATM is.
It's true. No, you're right. You're right.
Us into, Be My Eyes is a negotiation. It's like.
Yeah.
Well, it's difficult to find a situation that can't at least be framed.
That's true.
That is. You know what I mean?
Because it's our bag, we surprisingly keep finding it everywhere.
What I don't like is when it's boiled down to just that, right? Like the textbook, everything's an argument. I know it's a textbook title, but it's like, well, everything has an argumentative dimension, but everything isn't just argument,
Right.
Just like, the Gulf War wasn't just about oil, but it certainly was about oil.
Right.
Anyway, that's the gist of that. Oh, yeah. God.
Yeah. No, I think that's, yes.
So that's there. You can take a look at it and we can think about how to move forward. But I thought in like seeing this as like a lead in, it may need to be trimmed or something, but it's like, I didn't think it was too much of a stretch. Cause like, even with the chess cheating thing, I was like, is it time for this to go? But I was like, there's actually a connection here.
Yeah.
Excuse me, between the crisis there, because it's becoming too poker-like, this shift from chess to language. It's relevant. Yeah. And it's relevant.
And I think it's a nice, also it's a compelling reversal, but I think that also makes it a really interesting. Also, if we're thinking about just the move of the movement somewhat away from mechanical Turks proper, if we start with an example that's clearly related to mechanical Turks, insofar as the where Amazon gets that from, but takes it out of the realm of Turkering in particular, it's also a good anecdote that suggests our move away from mechanical Turks prop. So again, it's a nice bookend to starting with the reversal of who's inside who, which is great for all sorts of purposes. But maybe it also signals that we're now moving away from a explicit focused engagement with mechanical Turks, and we're now moving to resonant reversals of that.
Right.
Which then suggests, okay, now we're going to bring to bear what we've been doing into realms that are resonant with, but not reducible to Amazon's Turk service.
And just practically speaking, because you have this, is it a conference paper?
Yeah,
So, which has some of the language that potentially we can just pull over. I mean, even just as like
yeah,
placeholdery, because it starts with a similar move.
yeah.
This is a line. Oh, okay. I see what you've done here. It's like you're aligning your sort of first points and then so that they stick out. I see that. I'm looking at the draft and its alignment is unusual, but it looks like what you've done is highlight kind of talking points by putting them on the left margin and then indenting the paragraph text.
Yeah, Phil, little trick.
All
Okay.
right. That's the gist.
No, I think this is yeah. I
I
think
think it's a start, if nothing else.
it helps focus it, right? Yeah, because I think there's lots of threads in Duder's head.
Yeah. You know me, I prefer done to good.
Yeah, in all things. Well, that's accomplished.
That's
High five.
I'm a fairly frequent co-author, and it's like, is this good? It's like, it's better than that. It's done. We've got a draft. Draft is always better.
Yep. Sometimes, yeah, it was watching some show and someone says less. Somebody said less is more, and someone was also like, more is also more. Yeah.
All righty, we're done here. Hopefully your dog situation has been sorted out.
I have not heard them barking. So hopefully they are on, well, I don't want to say hopefully they're on somebody else's porch, but
hopefully the issue's been resolved.
yeah.
All right. Well, I guess I will see you in a fortnight.
Indeed. All right.
Stay easy.